Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Idea to Value podcast. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn, and I'm thrilled to have with me today Professor Roger Kneebone. Professor Kneebone is the Professor of Surgical Education and Engagement Science at Imperial College London and is also the author of Expert, Understanding the Path to Mastery. So today we're going to be talking about expertise, what it takes to become an expert, and all of the challenges and successes you might experience along the way. Professor Kneebone, it's wonderful having you here today.
Well, thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Welcome to the Idea to Value podcast, where in every episode we highlight the latest insights into creativity and innovation from experts around the world. I'm your host, Nick Skillicorn. I care about the evidence behind what makes ideas happen, and I've already helped thousands of people just like you through my unique insights into recent scientific findings of how creativity works. I also show you how to turbocharge innovation programs so they finally deliver on the value and ideas you've been struggling to execute. Get your free training on how creativity can be improved by registering now at www.ideatovalue.com. Now let's get on with today's episode. So, Professor Kneebone, for people who don't know about you or your work, could you just give us a very brief background as to where you got started and how you got to where you are now?
Well, I've been interested in the idea of what it is to become expert for a long, long time. And the idea of this book really came from many conversations I've had with experts in a wide variety of different fields. And I've tried to think what is involved in that process that leads from knowing nothing at all about something to many, many, many years later becoming expert. Thinking not so much about expertise as a sort of disembodied sort of science, if you like, but the human experience of what it means to become expert in something. Because I think we are, all of us, on a path towards becoming expert in various aspects of our lives. It might be in our work or hobby or an interest or something, many things at once. But most of the sort of models of becoming expert, I think, are rather oversimplified, and they overlook some of the internal processes that we all go through. And so I wanted to bring those into view. I wanted to write about those in a way that would make sense to a sort of non-specialist reader. But I also wanted to highlight some of the important things that I think are going on in the moment in our society about how we think about what it means to be expert and how we make judgments about whether to what extent we can trust or believe what people who purport to be experts are saying.
So in your view, what does it actually mean to be an expert? Is it just someone who has done all the reading and can recite all the facts, or is there some more nuances to what that word actually means?
No, I don't think. I think it's much deeper than that. I mean, I think it does require a lot of those things, and we can talk about that in a minute. But I think there's something about being expert that involves wisdom and the ability to look around a topic and draw on many, many years of experience. And I think we've seen that a lot over the last couple of years with the pandemic, in particular, where we have many people presenting views of a complex issue. But in order to really make our own judgments about how to respond to what's going on, we need to be able to make judgments about how much confidence to put in the views of other people. And so what I've tried to do in this book is to look at what is involved in that process that leads to somebody being able to be considered expert. And I think one of the key things about that is that it's something that takes a very long time. It can be very difficult to make judgments about whether or not someone is expert, and in some ways it's not exactly a binary thing. You are either absolutely an expert or absolutely not one, because it's a gradual process of progression that leads you to becoming more and more expert. And indeed, you never really get there. You just go on becoming more and more expert without actually reaching a final destination. But that process is a very long, drawn out process. And in this book, I've outlined the stages that I've found useful in thinking about what is going on. And I've drawn on the model that dates back to the medieval guild system, which many people in the West particularly are familiar with, the apprentice, journeyman, master progression. And I should say that we no longer use those terms in any gendered way, but I think they are useful because people have a sort of understanding that if you want to get really good at something, you need to go through a series of stages. And the guild model starts you off as an apprentice, where you're there in somebody else's workshop or their space, learning to do what they can do very well and you can't do at all yet. And it takes years as an apprentice when you're doing what other people tell you. And then there comes a time when you take up your indentures, you go out into the world, you journey across your country traditionally as a journeyman, as it's called. You apply your craft and your trade, you take responsibility for the work that you're doing, for the good things and also the mistakes that you might make. And you are responsible for the work that you do as an independent craftsman or practitioner. And then there comes a time many, many years after that when you become sufficiently experienced and skilled and wise to pass on what you've learned to other people coming on behind you and to have apprentices of your own. And that's traditionally called the stage of being a master. So, that's kind of a useful framing. But I think one of the problems about that is that it describes a process but doesn't really explain it. And so it says, okay, apprentice, journeyman, master, but what do those things actually mean? And so in the book, I've tried to unpack what those things mean and to explore what it feels like to go through those stages. And to do that, I've drawn on 22, maybe 24 completely different experts from a whole range of fields whom I've worked with and drawn on many more than that, but only 22 of them also come into the book. There's a taxidermist, there's a hairstylist, there's a close-up magician, there's a textile artist, there's a combat pilot, there's a chef, all kinds of people a stonemason who've been through these processes and are able to think about them and talk about them. Alongside that, I put my own experience, which is in the medical world, first as a medical student, then as a surgeon, a trauma surgeon working on patients who've been injured, stabbed, shot, blown up. Then in the second stage of my career as a GP, a family doctor in the southwest of England, and then as an academic at a big university. And so I've sort of drawn on that as the inside story as I've experienced it, and along the way developed various sort of interests and hobbies outside medicine altogether, which also shine light on this process. And then, of course, there's stuff that other people have written and you know, a number of different authors. And I've tried to weave all that together and divide those three stages into sort of subdivisions. And so the apprenticeship stage, I think, is one where you spend an awful lot of time doing stuff that you often find pretty boring, and you can't see why you have to do it.
The example that comes to mind there for me is you mentioned you'd done an interview with a chef, and if you hear about any of the history of any of the big chefs, when they first go into the kitchen, you hear about having to peel potatoes or chop onions, and it's nothing like this end goal that you have where you want to be an expert and you're preparing the finest cuisine. It seems so far away from there.
That's right, absolutely. And that idea of carving courgettes into barrel shapes or whatever, I mean, it seems, as you say, it seems completely unrelated to what you actually want to do. And one of the people who influenced me very strongly is a bespoke tailor called Joshua Byrne. He was very interesting about this because he said, you know, he hadn't always wanted to be a tailor. He was at university studying economics, actually, when suddenly he realized that actually he didn't want to do that. He wanted to become a tailor. So he became an apprentice tailor. And for the first 5 years, he did 2 apprenticeships, but for the first one, for 5 or 6 years, he was learning to make jackets. And he said for months and months, he was just sitting there. His example was making pocket flaps, the flaps on a jacket. And he would just have to make these pocket flaps again and again and again. And every so often his master would come along and just have a look, peer over and see what he was doing and just shake his head and say, no, not good enough. No way again, wouldn't tell him why. And Joshua said it was immensely frustrating because he just couldn't see why he had to do this. And there was a disjunction between what he knew he needed to do, which he could understand almost at once. But as he put it, it was years before he was able to do it because it involved learning how to do something through doing it again and again and again. Later on, that turned out to be far more useful than he thought it was at the time, partly because he knew how to make pocket flaps and tailors need to know how to do that, but much more so because through that process, he became immersed in the materiality of his world. He learnt about what it felt like with the different kinds of cloth and the different kinds of thread and the different needles and the different atmospheric conditions and, all those things that he didn't realize at the time he was learning. But he also learnt to work with the other people that he was at his bench with. And he learnt what it was to be able to cope with doing something really boring that needed to be done. And all those things turned out to be, he saw the value of those things much more clearly later on than he did at the time. So there's something about that experience of doing stuff under somebody else's direction that lays the foundations for you then being able to do stuff automatically to a very high standard that you can only get by practicing. It's like practicing scales or whatever, if you're learning a musical instrument, or vocabulary, if you're learning a language, any of those things, I think. And you have to do that for much longer than you feel you ought to very often. And in my case, in the medical world, it was learning to do procedures and take blood and assisting at operations. It's the same in every field, I think. But then you get to this fascinating time when you've done that initial training. You've qualified, in my case, qualified as a doctor, or you've qualified as an apprentice tailor, or something like that. And then you're often pretty pleased with what you've done. You've passed exams, maybe you want to show off. But you have to realize that actually nobody really cares about you, because it isn't about you, it's about whoever your work is for. And that might be your customer, your client, it might be your patient if you're a clinician, it might be your audience if you're a musician or magician or something. And one of the magicians I worked with said that he'd spent his teenage years, in front of a mirror making things appear and disappear and doing extraordinary things. But somebody said to him, look, this isn't really anything more than dexterity, unless for an instant, even if just an instant, somebody who's watching thinks that something completely impossible that couldn't have happened just has. So it's not about you, it's about your audience. It's about the experience you give them. And I think that that's really important, because that's about changing your point of focus from yourself to something outside yourself.
I couldn't agree more.
It's really important, isn't it? Because does that make sense to you?
It absolutely does. It's something I see a lot of creative people and also innovation teams and companies struggling with, where they don't realize that other people don't care about their ideas the way that they do themselves. Yes. The audience and the customer, they only care about what it does for them. They don't care about the hours or years, in many cases, it took for you to get there, and all of the emotional investment and sometimes blood and sweat and tears that went into getting you to that level of basic mastery.
Absolutely. I mean, I noticed this when I became a GP, and I'd been a surgeon, and I felt I'd done, I'd passed exams and done all sorts of stuff, and a penny dropped with me that actually people would come and see me in my consulting room, and they didn't have the slightest interest in any of that. All that made any sense to them was whether I could help them work out what their problem was and find ways of dealing with it.
So
all that stuff. I mean, for me, I needed to have done all that stuff, because I then needed to turn it into the ability to work constructively with people to find out what the problem was and decide what to do. But for the people, that was completely irrelevant. But the other thing that came out of that was that although it wasn't about me, it was about them. In another sense, it was about me because I wasn't just an interchangeable cipher. I was me. I had my own personality, my own way of engaging with people, and some people liked it and some people didn't. And so I was developing what the jazz musicians talk about as voice. You know, your individuality. You're not just an interchangeable podcast host. You're you, and you've got your personality and your way of doing your podcast and things, and it's different from how somebody else would do it. And some people will like it and some people won't. And so there's something about developing your individuality that can be intention, because it's not about you, but it is about you at the same time. And so I think this is a process of kind of growing up and maturing that takes quite a long time in this stage, on top of the quite a long time that it takes in the apprentice stage, because you're out there in the world and you're doing stuff in your own right, then when things go wrong, which they always will, your relationship with error is a different one, because as an apprentice you are kind of shielded from that, because you're not working with the most priceless things or people or whatever from the beginning anyway, and everyone expects you to make errors, and they kind of cushion you from that. But when you go out on your own, people don't expect you to make, or at least they expect you not to make errors. Now, if you fast forward to the mastery stage, then by the time people get to that stage, everybody at that stage knows that errors are inevitable, and they understand that it's about recognizing and mitigating and working with error. But in that middle stage, everybody, including you very often, and the outside world in particular, expect you not to make errors, and they are unforgiving. And so when you do make errors, as you always will, they bite you very hard. And that can be a tough one, because you need to, of course, I think, experience what it is to make errors and how to deal with it, how to recover, how to how to get over it, and how to incorporate the learning that you get from making errors without allowing it to demolish you.
Absolutely.
But you never quite know when those errors are going to happen.
But the question, the question for me then is, as you're moving from an apprentice stage where the way that you've described it, at least, I interpret it as repetitive and repetition and mastering the skills. So you're building up your skills of what has been done before. Someone has taught you this. And then you get into this journeyman stage, as you call it, where effectively you're now acting independently. From your research and your experience, where is this balance during the journeyman stage about continuing to master what has happened before, and, as you said, finding your voice and perhaps doing things differently and beginning to express your creativity in that sense?
So do you mean at what point do you start to be able to develop those different skills that go beyond what you've learned as an apprentice?
I mean, is it a point, or is it starting to have a combination of both? What I think it's a combination of both. Yeah.
I mean, the way I see it, you need to have that preliminary stage where you're laying the foundations of whatever you're doing. You're learning to play your musical instrument, or do your magic, or carve stone, or prepare courgette, or whatever it might happen to be. And in that process, you learn much more than you think you're learning. You learn how to do those component skills, but you also learn how to work with other people, how to share space, how to negotiate. You learn all that stuff. But then in that next stage, that journeyman stage, you are developing experience that to you is unique, and it is made up of the opportunities that you have, and the environment that you're in, and of course, particularly, I think, the unexpected and challenging situations you find yourself in, and by dealing with those situations, you build up a sort of repertoire that allows you to respond appropriately and effectively in the moment to things you couldn't predict. And I think that's, to me, that's about learning to improvise, not improvising in the sense of doing something in a lazy way where you haven't been able to be bothered to prepare properly. Not at all. Quite the reverse, in fact. It's being able to draw very quickly on all that stuff that has sort of accumulated over the years that have gone before, to do something, to do the right thing at the right moment when it happens. And that is something that I think you start to become more comfortable with as you become more experienced in that independent stage. And that becomes even more important when you move on to that mastery stage, where you are taking a different kind of responsibility. And again, it's another one of these, it's not about you, it's about them. But this time the them is people who are following in the path behind, so to speak, on the path that you're treading. And that is a responsibility not only to teach those people how to do the things that they need to do because they're at that early stage, but also having a responsibility for their overall direction and their development as a person. Because it may be that the best thing for them would be to follow exactly the path that you're treading, or it may be that actually their needs and their capacities and they mean that they should actually go in a slightly different direction or a completely different direction. And you have a responsibility to exercise wisdom and judgment in influencing and shaping the path of other people. And I think that that's a different, I think you need to have been around the block a lot of times yourself before you are able to do that. And you have to be able to subordinate your own wishes and see what is best for other people, and then think how best you can support them when they're doing that. But it is a really important one, and I think you yourself need to have experienced a lot of things going wrong and a lot of putting things right and a lot of recovery, so that you can recognize those things in other people when you see them happening to them, and you have the sort of generosity of mind, if you like, to support them and not just criticize, but to see these things as a constructive part of the process. And the more I think about it, the more I think that people who are truly experts are able to take that broadening out view of their field, and indeed sometimes take their field in a completely new direction, but certainly, have that broader view that is based on their own experiences and their own thinking and their own reading and their own all the things that they've done. But it takes a long, long time. And that takes us back to where we started in a way, is that you cannot expect, because so much of that is unpredictable. It's going to happen, but you don't know when or how. You have to be in it for a long, long time to get to that stage of being really good at it. And you have also to recognize, I think, that it doesn't have an end. I mean, Joshua the tailor said to me, when I asked him about this pathway, he said something that pretty much all the experts I've spoken to said, which is that he said, I know that there is no such thing as a perfect suit, but I'll never stop trying to make one. So there's something.
It's interesting you say that, because at the beginning of this interview, what I was honestly half expecting to hear is you progress through these stages from apprentice to journeyman to master, and by definition, when you hit the mastery, that is when you're classified as an expert. But it seems instead to be that expertise is something that builds up, it never ends, but at some point there's this transition from where other people will eventually start looking at you and say, okay, I respect him or her for now having this much more expertise than I do, and therefore they're good enough to do this role.
I think the expertise, or the being expert, is very often not only being able to do something, but deciding when or whether to do it at all.
And that's
a really high form of expertise, because that is not just being good at something, that's having the wisdom to judge whether that thing is the right thing. And the people who are most expert very often are the people who are least boastful, and indeed who are so much aware of how far they still have to go rather than how far they've already come, that they focus on that. And so because they know that they're not as good as they could be, they don't frame themselves as expert. In fact, people who talk about themselves as expert quite often, I think, aren't.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of people who would describe themselves as an expert, and I think unfortunately with the internet nowadays, people can claim to be whatever they want to be. There's this famous cartoon that says, on the internet, no one knows that you're a dog. So
yes, well, that's right. Well, actually, one of the magicians was very interesting when he talked to me about that. The close-up magicians I've been working with, Richard McDougall, who said that, you know, you go onto a YouTube video and you can learn how to do a trick, and it takes you, you know, a few months. You see people. He calls this doing magic from the elbows down, where you can you can relatively quickly become extremely good at doing something that you see somebody doing on the internet, and it's very impressive. But that is very different from magic from the elbows up, which is how you engage with an audience, how you make, as I say, how you give them that extraordinary sense that something impossible has just happened. That's not something you can get in the same way from watching a YouTube video. And there's a seductive illusion that because you can get very good quite quickly at parts of something, that means that you're good at the whole of it. And particularly since the whole of it depends on being able to do things that you don't have to do very often, but when you have to do them, you've got to do them fast and right, such as getting out of a problem when you've got into it, or remedying an error, or avoiding a catastrophe or something. You don't see that most of the time. You know, it's like the accidents that are avoided that never happen. But you know, many of those are because there are expert drivers, expert pilots, expert whatever it is, who are sufficiently experienced to see trouble coming and avoid it. And so there's something about these aspects of being expert that are hidden from view. But if you are, if something that you need to have done by an expert, or you yourself as you become an expert, you want people who've got to that stage, who have that level of experience and knowledge and wisdom. And that's why I think that being expert is it's a slippery thing in a way. It's very hard to pin down. It's easier to say what it isn't than to say what it is. But one of the things I think is very useful, one of the metaphors I use in the book is to say that you know, there are all these pressures to do everything more quickly, more cheaply, in a shorter time with fewer resources. But you can't bake a cake in half the time by putting it in the oven at twice the temperature. It just doesn't work. Well, you don't get a quicker cake, you just get a burnt cake that you can't eat. And there's something about, you know, there's only so much that you can compress these things.
Absolutely.
And so if somebody says they're an expert in something and they've been doing it for 8 months, you can be pretty sure that they're not an expert. They might have been doing it for decades and still not be an expert. But I think that you do have to have spent a long, long time going through these stages before you can hope to become in any way expert, because that's just how long the process takes. And it applies whether you're, you know, learning to become a footballer or a brain surgeon or a fighter pilot or anything else. I think
there's quite a bit of research which has gone into understanding creative high performers, whether they're scientists or musicians or business people, and there's very often this 10-year to expertise statistic that ends up being quoted. So it really does take a long time to go from being a thing.
This one is an interesting. This comes from a man called K. Anders Ericsson, as I expect you know, who died I think 2 years ago, who put forward this idea of 10,000 hours of sustained deliberate practice, which was then popularized by people like Malcolm Gladwell. But it was actually came from work done by Anders Ericsson decades ago, where he looked at what he called internationally elite performers. Some of them were concert violinists, some of them were, he did the same with chess players, all sorts of sportsmen. And his research showed that all of these people whom he classified as internationally elite performers had done a minimum of 10,000 hours, which is roughly equivalent to 10 years of what he calls sustained deliberate practice. And this became popularized. And I think there is, you know, in a way, that's what I was talking about whatever it is, if to get really good, you need to do it for a very long time. I think it has become distorted by a sort of unreliable corollary, which is that if you spend 10,000 hours doing something, you will become an expert. I think that is not necessarily the case.
I wrote an article about this a couple of years ago, going back to the original research, because the best example that I came up with showing why deliberate practice is different from just repetition and doing things is you wouldn't claim that a taxi driver who's been driving a taxi for 40 years can drive a race car like Lewis Hamilton can, even though Lewis Hamilton was doing it for a far shorter period of time. So it's not just the cumulative number of hours that you have been doing something. It's about constantly trying to improve yourself and pushing yourself in specific ways to get better at specific things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's something very interesting about looking at exactly that. You know, most of us get good enough at driving to get beyond the stage of obviously manipulating the controls and things. We pass our driving test, and then most of us, as we find that we have to use less of our attentional capacity to do the actual physical driving, we use that freed up attentional capacity to do other things, to talk to our passenger, to listen to the radio, to or whatever it is. But people like Lewis Hamilton and people who really want to get good at driving, they use that freed up attentional capacity in a different way. They use it to do different kinds of driving. It might be driving very fast if they're a racing driver, or driving in difficult conditions if they're a rally driver, or driving in skid pans if they're a police driver, whatever it might happen to be. But they that's where they place their freed up attentional capacity, whereas most of us don't. And I think that this idea of the sustained deliberate practice is very much about sort of continuing to put effort into getting better at whatever it is you want to get better at. But I think one of the other interesting things that came out of Erikson's work was that you tend to focus on the people if you look at people at the end when they've become very good at something and they've become international violinists or something, you just look at them, but or Olympic divers or whatever. But what you lose sight of is all the people who've been there along the way who've supported them. So, all the parents who took people to the swimming pool at 4 o'clock in the morning when they were 13, all those people who are always there. And it's never just one person. It's always a complex social network. And that this whole question of which goes back to the apprentices in their master's workshop or whatever it is, it goes back to the fact that becoming an expert is not a solely individual thing. It's a product of a whole load of influences and a whole lot of ways of engaging with the world, with the inanimate world, with materials and tools and objects and things, but with the social world too, with the people you're working with, the people who are more experienced or less experienced than you are, same level, all that kind of stuff, all has to go together, because becoming expert is not just the acquisition of a disembodied quality or set of skills. It is a developmental process, I think, by which we sort of evolve throughout our lives in whatever it is that we choose to spend energy on. And it may be our work, it may be a hobby, it may be an interest, or whatever it might. And for all of us, we've actually got a number of these strands going on at the same time. And I think in terms of business and creativity and things, it's worth bearing these things in mind, because having a sense of what these journeys that we're all of us on, what those journeys look like gives us a bit of a sense of what may lie ahead, as well as seeing the value of looking behind it where we've already come from.
Absolutely. Professor Kneebone, it's been wonderful speaking with you. I think we're coming up on time, but I've got one last question, and it's specifically bringing it back to creativity and innovation. And it's the potential dark side of expertise. In many fields, there's this phrase called the curse of expertise, sometimes also known as the Einstellung effect, where the more you end up practicing the same way of thinking, especially what's been taught or what you've seen work before and repeated as being successful for you, the harder it can become seeing new ways to approach new challenges. What's your view on how expertise can help you become very good at something, but what does it take to then also stay flexible and stay creative in the face of new information?
I think being aware of that danger is really an important part of it. I think there's some very interesting work that influenced me a lot by two researchers called Berreiter and Scardamelia, who draw a distinction between routine and adaptive expertise. And routine expertise is you get very good at doing something, and adaptive expertise is where you are needing to respond newly to whatever has turned up. And I think we, all of us, need the capacity to do both, because if we're doing something repetitive that is the same every time, there is absolutely no point in developing a completely new way of doing that every single day, because it just wastes a lot of effort. But on the other hand, if we get too involved in that way of doing things, then we frame everything that comes at us as needing to fit into that way of doing things. You know, to the man with the hammer, everything is a nail kind of thing. And so there's something about, I think, needing to be aware of the value of both of those ways of thinking, so that we don't become complacent and ossified and only think of things in one way, but hand over to our automatic pilot the things, I mean, like the pocket flaps example I was giving you. You know, if you're making pocket flaps, once you've learned how to make pocket flaps, it's a very useful thing to be able to do that to a very high standard, repeatedly, but without having to think it through from scratch each time you do it. But on the other hand, pocket flaps are only useful in certain contexts. And when you're trying to work out why a jacket just doesn't quite look right on somebody, then that's not, that pocket flap way of doing things won't work. You need to think creatively. You need to sort of stand back and make sure that you're not missing things. You need to click into a different way of thinking in your brain. And I think we can, each of us, operate in both those ways. But I think one of the sort of things of about the self-awareness that comes with becoming more experienced is that it becomes clearer and clearer which way of thinking is best in a given situation. And I think having remaining aware of both the advantages but also the drawbacks of operating in either of those modes is something that, with a bit of thought, and probably keep those two in tension at the same time.
Perfect. Wise words to live by. Professor Kneebone, it's been wonderful speaking with you. If people want to find out more about you and your work, what's the best place they can go to find out more?
Well, certainly there's my work website. It's Imperial College London. If you put in Kneebone, my surname Kneebone, and Imperial, you'll find links to that. I have a podcast of my own. It's called Countercurrent, all one word. Countercurrent. Again, if you put into your search engine Countercurrent and Kneebone, you'll come up with it. I've done about 160 now. Conversations, usually about an hour or so, not interviews, but conversations with people, pretty much all of the people in my book and many others besides. So if you want to get a sense of the breadth and the kind of things that I'm interested in, please do go to that. There's my book, of course, as you said, book called Expert, published by Penguin in 2020 and came out in paperback in August this year. So if you again put that into your search engine, that will come up. And also a lot of things I've written which you can find again by searching in the usual way. But I would say if you do want to find out more about these ideas, then do dip into my podcast, because I found that a fascinating way of exploring ideas, as we've been discovering over the course of this conversation, exploring ideas without knowing where the conversation is going to go, but being open for it to go in different directions. And that's been one of the things I've developed over the course of those 160 episodes.
Perfect. I'll make sure to get all of those links down in the description below. Professor Kneebone, it's been wonderful speaking with you, and I look forward to speaking again with you soon.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening. If you liked it, please like, share, and subscribe, and leave me a comment about what you thought and what you'd like to see more about. If you want to take your creativity and innovation capabilities to the next level, then invest in yourself with the premium training only available at ideatovalue.com. These exclusive training modules have all been put together by me, Nick Skillicorn, and have been used by thousands of artists, innovation leaders, and CEOs to become better at understanding the source of their creativity and executing on their innovation ambitions. And there is no risk to you, as they are backed by our money-back guarantee. Now, don't forget to go out there and make your ideas a reality. See you again soon.